podcast is being sponsored by my friends over at Real Mushrooms, my friend Jeff Chilton and his son Sky. I interviewed Jeff on one of the earlier episodes of this podcast. Really happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. They sell medicinal mushrooms, things like reishi, chaga, lion's mane, turkey tail, cordyceps. I think more and more people are becoming familiar with the truly amazing benefits of medicinal mushrooms on our physical, our mental, even our spiritual well-being. They're an amazing company. They're one of the few, if any, companies that's not only 100% organic, but 100% mushrooms, and that's really rare. A lot of companies have fillers or additives, or also important, it's not the mycelium that's grown on grain and mixed together, it's the actual mushroom, and that's a really rare thing. It's a really pure product. It's the only product, the medicinal mushroom product that I take. Super happy with them, super happy that they're sponsoring this podcast. If you'd like more information about them, you can check out their website at realmushrooms.com/universe to also receive 25% off of your first order.
On this episode of the podcast, I sat down with Josie Castañeda. Josie is a really interesting woman. She has a really interesting story. It was also quite serendipitous in that we share a mutual friend whose name is Darrah. Jan's a really great guy. We were quite close. We spent a while together in the Peruvian Amazon, working at a large ayahuasca center there. We shared some really amazing times together, so it was really serendipitous that we happened to both know him. Josie is also an author. She wrote a book, a very good book. I actually have a copy of it right here, if I can hold that correctly. It's called Latine Herbalism, A Beginner's Guide to Modern Curanderismo, Healing Plants and Folk Traditions of the Americas. And interestingly, in that book, she actually interviewed our mutual friend Jan, so maybe a little shout out to him as well. It was really a pleasure for me to sit down and connect with her. She has a beautiful energy, beautiful presence. As the book mentions, it's a beginner's guide for kind of the healing arts, the arts of curanderismo, as it's often called in Latin or South America. And just as the book said, it's a really beautiful introductory book. I think she does a really good job of going over a lot of the terminology, the basics, the structure, kind of breaking it down into easy to understand format, a lot of practical recipes and tools to really begin this path and to begin to develop a relationship with these tools for oneself, for one's family, for maybe eventually one's community. As I said, she has a beautiful presence. It was really a pleasure to talk to her, to hear her share about her story, and kind of her journey in life, different practices she's done, kind of rediscovering her roots in Mexico and Cuba. And I had a really good time with this conversation. I think she shared some beautiful things, and I think and trust you all will get a lot out of this conversation. As always, if you're able to support this podcast, Patreon is a really good option. As always, to all the patrons, thank you so much for your help. It's always really meaningful. I really like websites like that because they work on this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's an amazing way to give back. And also in that spirit of reciprocity, it gives you a lot of interesting things back as well. Things like early access to shows, bonus material, Q&As. And as always, if you're not able to do that, always helping with the algorithms is a big help too. So if you're viewing this, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, leaving a starred rating and a short review. Also, if you're interested in working with myself or my colleague Marav Artsy, at the time of filming this, we're actually sold out for our final retreat of the year, which is November in the Sacred Valley of Peru. But hopefully by the time this is released, by the end of October, we should have our schedule out for 2026. So if you'd like more information about working with us, about the work we do, you can visit my website at nicotianarustica.org, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So I think that's it for the intro, and without further ado, here's my conversation with Josie.
Running out from the maze, running out of the maze today. Running out from the maze, running out from the maze, running out from the maze today. I'm running out from the maze, running out from the maze, run out of the maze today.
So yeah, welcome to the show. We were chatting a little before we started, and somehow I didn't realize this before today when I was going back over your book, that we have a mutual friend in common, and we were talking about him. So maybe just to start by saying hi to our friend Jan
Hi,
Darrah.
Yancito. That's what I call him.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful human
He's a
being.
beautiful man. We spent quite a while together working in the Peruvian Amazon, and shared some similar medicine and medicine paths. And he's a really beautiful human being. So I'm really happy that you know him, and that he kind of put you in touch with me. And yeah, so just a little shout out to him.
Yes.
And so maybe to start, you have a really interesting backstory. You speak about it in brief in your book, but maybe just to familiarize the audience listening with a bit about your story, who you are, kind of your path in life that led you to who you are now, to the work you're doing, and to this book you wrote.
Sure, definitely. So my name is Josie Castañeda, but I'm the author name is Iosellev Castañeda. My name is Russian, and it was given to me by my father, who was Cuban, and my mother is Mexican. My father passed away, I think 7, 8 years this December, I forget. But so, my father was born in 1935 in Cuba, in the jungles of Cuba, before Cuba was even incorporated, and my mother was born in Mexico, Iotepeque, Morelos, and she was born, you know, also what I call and what I tell people the dirt for. This is where before people had houses, when people were living in little shacks, you had a little piece of terreno, or like a little parcel, or a little piece of something, and that was bought by maybe your great grandparents, or it was given to them, right, when they were colonized, and then all of a sudden you could do a little shack. So that's how my parents were raised. So for them, what they wanted for me, their only daughter together, was for me to be educated, to be married, to have children, to have a good job, and then done, death, right? And that is when I tell this story to people, is that's a very linear life. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? But once you get more into the healing arts, you understand that life isn't a linear, but it's a spiral, right? You can end up at the same place on the other side of the place, right? And so for me, I sort of spiraled out of that linear life when I was in my 30s. But before that, what I did is I went to school. I went to a design school, fashion school, Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. After living in Miami, I left when I was 17 because my birthday's in December, and it just, the way the school schedule works, I always end up being a little bit younger in school. So I left when I was 17. I graduated when I was 21 from college, and I stayed in New York City. I lived there for 19 years. And in those 19 years, I worked as a fashion designer. So I was, corporate all the way, if you want to say that. I was working those hours. I was doing that life. But on the side, I always had something going on. And I did that because my godmother, my mom's, it's a woman that raised my mother, but she's not really blood family. And I know that, in Latin America, we have family that is not blood family, like real family. We treat them like that. We act with them the same way. And my godmother had a restaurant, still does. And I always knew I wanted my own business. I didn't know what it was. So even while I was working full-time as a designer, I always had a side hustle, what people call today a side hustle. And for me, it started when somebody asked me in a yoga class, hey, can you make me something? My body is it's in pain. I'm a Mysore student. I do Mysore yoga, and I'm in pain, and I need something. I was like, sure, I'll make a little formula for you. Because at that point, I had already been studying Ayurveda, apothecary. I had already started studying herbalism, in the Western traditional method. And so, somewhere along the way, I realized that in order to maintain my life as a designer, I needed something else. Something else needed to help me. And so for me, it became herbs. Back then, at least I didn't have the capacity to go and find pharmaceuticals, right? So I was using herbs, using chamomile tea, lavender tea, all that kind of stuff. And then I was just piqued in interest. And so I started doing a side hustle, which included making products and doing markets. And somewhere along the way there, I realized, between what I'm doing now as a corporate designer, which was more managing, and what I see maybe my future being with this particular business, I think I went out. I think I'm ready. And that took me about 19 years to figure out all on my own. But during those 19 years, I did yoga certifications, I did Ayurvedic studies. I studied with some beautiful, amazing, incredible herbalists in New York City. And that's when things started to shift. That's when I was like, wait a minute, I grew up with this stuff. We had herbs in the house. My father would make me these teas, which I give, a recipe of the tea that he used to give me when I was younger. Like my dad used to do all these things. We do these baños, these baths every New Year's whenever I'm home. Like there's something here. And so I think for me, it was sort of like spiraling out of this linear life and then sort of figuring out that it's something that I've already knew, that I already had in me. And it was sort of like, I use the word lightly, but reclaiming the knowledge that I already had, which I didn't know I had, because everybody told me that that's not worth anything. And even still today, but we'll get into that conversation later, people don't put any value to that kind of work. The work is how much money you're making, what type of car do you have, how big is your house, like what school are your children going to? Is it private? Why is, like all of these things that we talk about. That's how I was raised. But I realized for me, it wasn't working anymore, and it wasn't that it wasn't working financially, because it was just my heart wasn't in the fashion industry anymore. I wanted to be a designer. I wanted to be creative. And the higher I went, because I didn't just be a designer those 20 years, the higher I went, the less design it was. So, I started to find creative ways, I guess, with people asking me, hey, can you make me a formula for this? Hey, what do you think I should have for that? Like that became my creativity. And I realized that maybe a couple of weeks ago, that's how I've been using my creativity. So for me, I've been doing this now for 12 years. So, and it took a lot of courage for me, because my family, specifically my father, he was very, very poor when he was young, very, very poor. And he was like, what are you going to do for money? How can you do this? You went to school. Like for them, education is such a big deal. They're like, you went to school, you did 4 years, and like, how can you throw all that away? And I don't think, it's very difficult to explain to somebody who thinks that way how you can use all of those skills in a different format, which is pretty much what I'm doing. But it was very interesting that he never once asked me, like, is this really something you want to do? Is this really something that comes from your heart? Do you really enjoy this? Like, that was never a question until later. I think he realized when he saw me working with people, like, I really did enjoy it, and he had a very special saying about that. But I think for a lot of people, who have maybe gotten a little stuck in that idea that, oh my God, I have to have the job and the money and the car and the house, it's hard to understand the change that can happen in your life when you make a decision. This is all yours. Nobody can tell you, nobody can listen to your family. It's you. Like, you have to have that choice. And for me, it was very clear. I want to say maybe 5 years before I left the industry, like, I'm done here. I'm done. This is no longer in any way making me happy, and I'm ready to leave. And then after that, it became okay, I'm done with New York City too. It's a beautiful city. I like to go once a year. I love it. I like to go, especially in the fall. I think it's gorgeous. But I was done physically, emotionally, mentally. I had felt like that energetic just really close for me. And I didn't really know exactly where I was going, but I knew it was that. So, so for me, that's the way it worked out. I spiraled right out of that. But I also, I had the capacity, I had money, financially, I was supported, myself. I supported myself in being able to try different things, to do different things. So I was able to step outside of that a little bit. But that's how it happened for me. And I know some people have done life changes like that, which is very different. And so, so if I go from being a fashion designer to what I do today, which is, I call myself a modern day curandera. I'm not traditional in any way, and I'm not trying to follow a tradition. I'm also not a shaman. Let's make that clear. But that's what I am. I'm a modern day curandera, and I do a blend of yoga, meditation, which is usually transcendental meditation, and curanderismo all together. And I infuse that with a little Reiki. And what I do is I have a 3-pronged business. What I do is I offer products, which is how I started, very physical products. I offer education. I love to teach people to do this for themselves. And I also offer cultural exchange. So I love to travel. And so part of what I do is I like to take people to Mexico. I like to take people to Guatemala. And so that's what I do today. But my heart really is the clients that I work with. I love the one-on-one. So yeah, that's my story in a nutshell.
I also moved to New York just after school, and I didn't spend quite as long there, but I think I was there for about 11 years,
Yeah,
maybe a little
you're a real New
longer.
Yorker. They say 10 years. 10 years makes a real
Yeah.
New Yorker.
Well, I felt like a New Yorker when I left, and it was actually the Amazon that took me away, and I thought it would be temporary, but it ended up being even longer than that span of time. I think one of the interesting things about New York is people often look at it as like the belly of the beast,
Yeah,
the belly of like capitalism and consumerism and, working and a lot of the things you were describing. But at the same time, it's a fascinating place in that, I mean, you can literally find everything there. I mean, any
it's that
practice, any
convergence. It's
teaching.
that convergence, which is what I
Yeah,
love. You can definitely find a little
yeah,
bit of everybody there. Yeah.
yeah. What was that like? I mean, how was that like balance of you of working this corporate fashion job at the same time discovering all these different paths like Reiki and herbalism and yoga? I mean, that's New York is a very active city, but what was that kind of journey like for you of kind of beginning to dip your toes and to really immerse yourself in all these other things there?
So I think the first time I started really questioning, like, oh, what's that? That sounds interesting. I want to get into that, or I want to learn more about that. It was with Julia Graves. Julia Graves is a French German healer. She's an incredible person. She had students already in New York, and she would travel from Europe to New York, and she would teach. The first time I sat down to do anything energetic before even Reiki, it was a flower essence. And it was just like, wow, energy in a bottle. Wow, that's like, let's see if it works. And it sure did. And it was beautiful. So that's how it started. And then through students that I met there, it became, that sort of like became my support system almost. Through students that I met there, I found an herbalist. Her name was, oh, I don't remember her name. She used to have a company called the Herbal Bear. And the first thing I did was soap. It was very simple. It was soap. I was like, oh, I'll mix some soap. It'll be fun. And I was like, oh. And then she started talking about all these other things about herbs that you can add. And I was like, oh, herbs, right. I remember those. And then that's how it kind of sort of spiraled. And I remember that I met Julia through one of the students that I had met through a yoga training. So that's like sort of like how it spiraled and bulked out, like just, yeah, on its own. It was having conversations with people, because I think that's one of the things that people think about New York is that we're not friendly. But when we're there, New Yorkers have real presence. And I think it's because everything is so fast, right? When you stand with them, they're right here and they're talking and you're not. And so when you're at these workshops, everybody's present. Everybody wants to know each other, like there is that. And so I think that's for me how it started. I went to her flower essence workshop. I sat next to somebody who even today we still think we've known each other from either school, from this. She was a designer as well, which I didn't know at the time, but we just started talking. And she's like, I think I know you. Did you go to FIT? But we didn't go even on the same year. So it was very strange. We still talk to each other and it's like, wow, because we know we knew each other, but we don't have a clue from where. And so I started talking to her and then she started talking and it was just, we just started talking. And next thing I know, I'm going to these herbal classes. I'm learning how to make soap. I'm doing all these little things that, that just were interesting to me at the time. They were just interesting. I never set out to do a business and to go, oh my God, now where's the business? Never. At that point though, I did start doing some studies in Ayurveda, and we didn't have online then, believe it or not. This is way back when, right? But I was learning from an Indian woman that was part of my yoga center at the time. And so it was just inquiry. It was just me wanting to learn. And so when I look in hindsight, there might have been some memory in the back of my mind, some memory of either sitting with my great grandmother, because my mother's side grandmother, which is where I was really the closest, she wasn't interested in any of this. But my great grandmother was, and she was still alive. I got to get a chance to meet her until I was probably like 13 or 14. She used to raise turkeys, and she was the one that used to make different kinds of like homemade products, apothecary products for hair, for face. She's the one that was the doula and the midwife for all her daughters. So there was some memory in there, something that must have been like sparked. because that's how it started for me. It was one workshop with one thing, and then it was like, oh, what else is there? Yeah.
So, one of the things that's really interesting is, you mentioned this idea of like a doula and people who work with herbs, and I think often in this kind of work, like everyone kind of gets grouped into one category. Like even as you said, like I'm not a shaman. People often think about all of these things as one category, but also as you talk about in your book, is that there's many different roles that a healing practitioner or a sabio or a wisdom keeper could undertake. I mean, there's these ideas of like a doula, a midwife, a huesero or huesera, a vegetalista, or a curandero. So, can you maybe speak a bit about, like, from your experience and your writing, like what some of these different roles are? Because we throw around these terms a lot, like curandero or maestro or shaman or huesero, or and there's so many different terms, and I think they often get used kind of interchangeably. I mean, huesero maybe not, that's very specific, but you spoke a bit about some of these different roles in your book. Can you maybe kind of define some of these? Because I think they're often they're words that get used so often, but often we don't maybe necessarily have a deeper understanding of them.
Sure, I'm happy to. When I teach curanderismo, I tell them, we have these particular categories. And sometimes one person is one category, and then you have one person that does a variety of them. And why is that? Let's start with that part. I think a lot of it is, if you're in a little itty bitty town and the medical doctor is 40 miles away, one person will take on 5, 6 different roles because they have to. They have to. Now, is that person going to be as skilled as somebody who does that one role since they're like 5 years old? Probably not, right? So those are the reasons for why sometimes people do a lot of different things at once, or they do just one thing. I think a lot of women in Mexico, like I want to say great grandmother, great grandmother and great great grandmothers were both midwives and doulas because they had to be. They were having 17 children and there was no medical doctor around. So you kind of have to learn how to do this, you got to figure it out. And also it's survival. You want your daughter and your grandchild to survive. So you kind of have to learn, right? And so those are the reasons why sometimes these roles either are very special or specific or not. So when I teach people, I say we have 4 categories that I know of. Since I've been doing a lot of podcasts, I've been told there's maybe a couple extra ones, so I'll talk about them today also. So the first one is you have people who are to me, and this is the way that I was taught, and the way that when I go to Mexico, because I go every year, I'm 48. I left Mexico when I was 7 years old, but I've gone back every single year. And every single year, I try to stay a little longer so I can learn more about what's happening, especially after I made the very particular decision to be quote unquote a healer. They won't call me a curandera. They're like, you're not a curandera. You weren't born in this tradition with us, and you don't believe in Jesus. That's very clear for me. So I'm like, okay, no worries. You can call me sanadora. Sanadora means healer. If anything, sanadora is a safer word because you're not dealing with that interaction of religion, right? As a healer, you can walk into any space. As a curandera, you better bring that cross and you better bring that Virgin Mary. Otherwise, you're not going to believe in what you do. So it's very particular in Mexico. And I understand and I agree with it. And it's totally fine by me. But to me, language it's very tedious now. And, even in America, you say certain things and it's like blown out of proportion. It's like, actually, all I meant was XYZ, right? So language has become a thing. So when I tell people I'm a modern day curandera, I also know I usually I don't do it here with you because your audience understands, but when I've done other podcasts, I'm like, I always sideline with, that just means I'm a healer. That's it. I don't get involved with the teeny tiny details. But in Mexico, we have curanderos. Like when we talk about a curandero, we talk about people who are midwife and doula in one. They're the most specialized. They're the ones that people still believe in today. And I think it's because they are specialized. Usually it's women. I've learned from Julia, who has a lot of connections to Haiti. There are midwives and doulas that are men in Haiti. And I'm like, wow, that's interesting and different. I've never really thought about that, but I'm sure it could work because we have gynecologists that are men. But in Mexico, always women. And always, that is one thing that I say, it's very similar to what I would consider shaman tradition, which is it's a lineage. Your great, 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 great grandmother was a doula and a midwife, or a doula or a midwife. But that is where it comes from. That's number one. Number two, we have hueseros y hueseras, which are people who deal specifically with the structure of the bone. And what does that mean? That means it is not just bones, it's tendons, it's muscle, it's fascia, or what we call today fascia, which didn't exist even 10 years ago. And they're very specific about the bodily function, right? Like, how does the body move and movement? You can even call it rolfing if you want to, because they talk a lot about movement, right? That's a huesera or huesera. Then you have what people could just call curandera, like general curandera. And those are women and men who are yerberos y yerberas, which do herbs and know a lot about herbs. They know how to take them internally. They know how to use them externally. They can do a walkabout and show you all the herbs around them, right? And they can find the similarities or the family types of different herbs, right? So if you learn the shape of a certain herb, you go out there and you find something similar. That means that they're a family, maybe a variety, and you can maybe use them in the same way. So those are like the yerberos y yerberas specific. They're herbalists, I would say, on steroids, because they believe they're very hardy in their herbs and they believe the herbs can cure absolutely everything. I don't have that belief. I think there's some things that are not curable with herbs alone that I do feel and I do use medical intervention with, traditional medical intervention, but they're hardcore. Herbs are the ones, right? So we have those three that are the most specific. And then you have people who are just basic curanderos. And those are usually the ones that are more, I want to say, connected to spirit. And usually those are like abuelitos y abuelitas, grandmas and grandpas. Even if they're not grandma and grandpas, they're older. People think that if they come and they touch you, you're healed. That's simple. It's not very heady. It's not a lot of talk. There's no pláticas. It's just, ay, abuelito, dame la bendición. Grandpa, give me the blessing. And they just touch you and you feel like, oh, everything's good, right? And so those are the basics that I know of. Then you have people who call themselves curanderos who do everything. Everything there. They do the herbs. They do the hueseros, or massage. They're great with cups, by the way. Let me tell you, they do cupping, which is amazing. Women who may be midwives. Doulas, but not midwives. Midwifery requires, and just so we can know the difference, doulas are usually the people that support the mother during the process of gestation and birth and afterbirth. And midwives are women who are actually in there, who can actually tell you the baby's coming in 20 minutes, your contractions, they're listening to the baby's heart. They're more physical in that way. So that takes a little bit of extra training, right? As you can think, if you're going to be touching women and babies, right? But doulas are there for support. So these curanderas would be, who have that, they will be part doulas, not midwives. So you have people who, again, they mix all of that together. And when it comes to the specialty of curanderismo, and this is the part where I feel it's a little bit different than shamanism. Everybody believes that person has a gift. I don't like the word spiritual, but I'm going to have to use it. But they feel like they have a spiritual gift. So in other words, what does that mean? That means that they have a connection that's a little bit more attuned than the regular person to something higher than themselves. Usually it's some kind of saint or some kind of virgin or just Jesus. And you will know because when you walk into their space, it's a big giant picture of them. That's what you will see first. And then you see the person sitting next to them. And a lot of the times they will heal in the name of the saint or virgin. That's very typical of Mexico. And then you have the new age curanderos, which is where things get very shady. You have people, men and women, who do all the new age stuff because they heard somebody talk about it and not always experience. And maybe that's where I think that the shady part comes in. I think a lot of the old school curanderos have experienced a lot of personal healing, number one, right? Either from other curanderos, and that's how they got inspired, or they have been healing for a really long time, right? So people who have seen either other healers or been part of a healing community, maybe since they were 10 years old, and they understand and they see and they do, right? That's, to me, like what old school curanderismo is. New age curanderismo is people who, because in Mexico, you can get away with so many things. And, there's so many people in this teeny tiny space that you can get away with so many things. And my aunt always tells me that. She says, in Mexico, what's the point of a license when you can, nobody knows what you're doing. You can do whatever. And so there's a lot of New Age curanderos who do all kinds of things without any training, without any real soul. At least the soul of, like, I want to help others. It's more like, how much money can I make? And they do all these other things aside from the traditional things that I just spoke about. And they do cacao ceremonies, but there's not a image of ish cacao. There's no talk about how cacao came to be. Like there's no backstory to what they're doing, right? And so those are the New Age ones. Those are the ones that do the tarot. Tarot was not something that was considered to be curanderismo. That was something very specific of the Spaniards, and the curanderos would actually say, no, we don't read cards. That's the devil work. We don't do that kind of stuff. And it's a very Spanish thing, because that was something that they brought to us, very European. And so they do tarot. They do, like, I want to say, sort of superficial herbalism. There is no real follow through. They'll just say, here, have this. What's wrong with you? Here, have that. There isn't a real plática happening, and then we can talk about the details of what curanderismo really is, but like there's no real plática happening. So, they just ask you and it's very medical. What's your problem? Oh, drink this. Meantime, there's no other conversation being had. They do limpias sporadically. They don't, for me, when I do limpia, there's certain processes that I was taught that I have to happen. They don't have that. They just sort of do. And, so that's the New Age curanderos, which is what a lot of people know. And because of that, and I want to say that idea of the New Age curandero has been around for maybe like 10, 15 years now. And so now there's this big backlash in Mexico with the word curanderismo, which is really sad for me, because that when people think of curanderismo in Mexico, that's what they're thinking. They're thinking this New Age person, usually, I want to say over, and I'm part of that too, even though I'm going to be 50 soon, but like over 50, it's all about the money. It's all about how they look, they look like a New Age shaman, that whole idea. And so there is a bit of a backlash, and they'll tell you, don't go to a curandero. They don't know what they're talking about, but it's sort of tainting the tradition in a way, a little bit. But I do feel like some of those people do have a little bit of that gift. Some of them do have a little bit of that connection to spirit. Not all of them. A lot of them, again, they're doing it for money, but some of them are doing it for the right reasons, and they're just put into this space because of their age, like myself. But the tradition is very specific, and nobody talks about it because there's really no books written about it. There's books about herbalism, right? You can find books in Latin American and Mexican herbalism. And I know, because I researched before I did my book, like, what can I talk about that hasn't already been talking about? It's like, it's impossible, right? But there are books out there, but nobody really talks about the specifics of curanderismo, which is really that you have to have that special don. El don, the don is that spiritual connection to something above and beyond you, and it's very hard to find people who have that. But I think in the tradition, when it comes to like the specifics, that's really what you have. You have the yerbero, who's the herbalist, the huesera, who is all about the structure of the bones, right? And what goes through the bones, tendons, muscles, midwife and doula all in one. And then you have the ones that do everything because they kind of have to, because they're away from everybody else, and again, traditionally the curanderos, were the people who were the doctors of the village. So that's, if you really think about that role, what can that person play? It had to play into the needs of the community, whatever that community was at the time. So if you had a lot of farmers, you had to learn a lot of things about like parasites, right? You had to learn a lot, which it's a big thing in Mexico. But you had to learn about parasites. You had to learn how to heal cuts and wounds. Like there were certain things that you had to learn if you were going to be a curandero. And again, it's a response to the community. What does the community need? But now, because we don't really have that, the little bit of curanderos that we have, like there's curanderos in Oaxaca, and you would never know. One, they don't call themselves curanderos or curanderas, and they're dressed very simply. It's a woman or a man from the town. They always happen to live away from people, which is really interesting. That part I have noticed. But they're just very simple people. They're not talking about anything that you think is weird. They just talk to you. It's a conversation that you're having one-on-one, and sometimes that is the plática, and it's really interesting. And sometimes it's just they want to get to know you better, but that's what I think makes it traditional for me. in a way. And sometimes, some of the new age or curanderismo, and I always tell that people when people tell me I met somebody they're curandera like you, do you want to meet them? And I say, wait, are they curanderos or are they new age curanderos? Because there's a fine line. There's a fine line there. But you can find some really incredible people. People, and like Jan always tells me I'm so genuine, and I'm like, I don't even know what that means. Like for me, like I have no idea what that means. I'm learning now. I'm getting more feedback for myself as to what that means. But like finding that genuine healer that really wants to help you. And for me, even if somebody isn't a curandero, but they really want to genuinely help somebody, I will call them a curandero. And a lot of the people in the book that I have on my last chapter, none of those people will call themselves curanderos. None of them, including Jan. But I believe he is one. The work that I've seen him do and the work that he does for people, and Natasha in Puerto Rico and my friend Erin in San Diego, they are curanderos, and they believe that they can really help somebody when there is that trust in the exchange. So that's like a really long, complicated, answer to your simple question, but it's part of that. It's part of the categories. It's not, nothing is traditional anymore. And I don't know how it is in the Amazon because it's a little bit different down there, but nothing is traditional anymore. Everything is now a way of responding to community. So, I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that was a beautiful explanation. You spoke a lot about Mexico, and Mexico is a fascinating place. I mean, because it still is very rich in a lot of indigenous or Amerindian traditions. I mean, like still very strong, very very prevalent. I mean, just being there, you can feel that. I mean, you even mentioned like Oaxaca. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time there, and it's still very much part of life there. Um, the other side of your family that you mentioned, interesting, I think your father's side is from Cuba. Are you able to speak about that at all? Or, because Cuba is also a very fascinating place. I mean, not just in kind of the politics and the isolation aspect, but also in its history, its people. I mean, in Mexico, you have a very strong indigenous community, also very much influenced by the Spanish. So you have these two very strong traditions, which also created something new. In Cuba, you have that also, but you also have a very strong African influence too, which very much affected the traditions of healing practices and knowledge practices in Cuba. Is that something you can speak about also? Like anything you're familiar with these Cuban practices? Because in Cuba, they have some very interesting practices too. And also something you mentioned earlier, that this idea of like the extended family. I mean, I think Cuba is probably the place where I felt the most that somehow everyone was like part of a bigger family. Like there was very little defining between like me and not me. I mean, it just everyone was taken in, and it was very beautiful to see that. But Cuba's such an interesting place in that way, that it has become very specialized and a very rich history in its healing practices as well.
I wish I had more about the Cuba side. Unfortunately, my father rejected a lot of the religion and a lot of the philosophy. He had a very difficult relationship with his family. Let's put it that way. And because that was difficult, it was difficult for him to express certain things. I can share with you that my dad, at some point, when when he lived in the jungles, they were their own healers. You know, and he would say his mother was a curandera because she knew how to heal everything. She kind of had to, she had to. There was no, literally they lived on the edge of the beach on a shack. It was in their home. It was a shack. Everybody lived there. And so, they were very poor, and you sort of kind of have to figure it out. And so I think and I remember asking him, like, what was your favorite game when you were little? You know, and this is an adult person asking. It wasn't like I was little and I was an adult. I asked him because, our favorite game was figure out the herb. I was like, figure out the herb? What's that? And he's like, so the kids would get together. They would go into the bushes. They would rub their fingers on an herb, and they would come back and go, okay, go find which one that was. And so, of course, the boys would always rub their butt and be like, here, guess what that, so like that. And that's why he loved that game. He thought it was so hilarious. And I was like, oh my God, but that was him. He was a jokester. So they didn't really have, at least I know that he didn't really have a very strong religious upbringing or anything like that, because they and maybe it's a good time to talk about, like, in Latin America, poor and middle class slash rich. When you're poor in Latin America, you're invisible. It's that simple, as it is in India and in many different places. And when you're poor, you're invisible. You don't exist. You're not. And so, we're talking with a community of people who everybody's poor, and this is where the whole political situation happens. All these people who feel invisible. Somebody like, I'm going to say it, Fidel Castro comes down, because that's where he started. He started with the poor people. He goes, hey, I see you. That's what Che Guevara was, right? I see you. We're going to take down. We're going to go do this. We're going to, and then they go, and then they have this giant war, and then everybody gets given something that's not really there. I mean, it's a whole complicated situation, and we spent hours on that alone. But this is a community that's not being seen. This is a community that's invisible, and so you don't have a lot of self confidence, right? I'm going to share one of my father's interviews, because he was in Cuba. So his story was this: he was very poor, and then he became very, very famous, like Elvis style famous. He was a singer. He used his voice as a singing, as his tool for life, right? And so when he became very, very famous is when Fidel was maybe a year in, and he was eventually put into jail, and he was going to be assassinated because he spoke against the regime. And he said, you told us it was going to be better. This is worse than it was before. Are you kidding me? And, just because of where we are today in America, the first thing that Fidel did was shut down radio and shut down TV. That's what he did. He completely took over them. And so my father was very vocal in that. And so he left Cuba in disgrace, and he was never allowed to go back in. He went back in once when I was in my early 30s, because I said, I've never been to Cuba after I was 4 years old. I want to go see the little bit of family that we have left, because everybody was passing away. And I didn't realize then that what I really wanted to do was connect with the elders, and I go there, and my uncle, he's a farmer, and he like brings home this fresh stuff, and he's showing me herbs, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But that's as much of the connection that I have. I haven't been back to Cuba. It's very difficult. When you go as a tourist, people think it's so cool, because, oh my God, you're there, you see old Cuba, and you feel like it's something sort of like novelty. But for us who have family there, and who go there, and like there's no food, and there's no water, and there's no electricity, that's a reality. You don't see that as a tourist, but the rest of us see that. And it's very difficult for people to be genuine when they're in need of something. On a little side note, one of the things that I learned, the reason that I was able to actually sit and meditate, is because all of my needs were met. When all your needs are met, you can do other things. You can step outside of that comfort zone, because everything is met. You are comfortable. But people like that who are uncomfortable, when the lights are out, when there's no water, they are smiling, but when that happens and they sit next to you, they're like, hey, can you get me out of here? Hey, can you give me some money? Hey, and it's very sad. It's very sad. And for me, it's very difficult to go into spaces like that where there's so much sadness, because that's, there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of remorse, there's a lot of, and it's very difficult for me. So I haven't been back to Cuba since I was in my 30s, like early 30s. And so I went with my father, and if anything, he was very, and I guess I can tell you the story, because I'm not embarrassed for it, but it might be a little sad for some people, and it might be a little triggering for some people if you're Cuban and you're listening. So I'm back with my dad, and we go up the stairs to this beautiful hotel. Turns out the hotel used to be the jail. And he looked at me, and he just started crying. He goes, I know. He's like, I know that what my eyes are seeing right now is a hotel, but my mind is seeing, and he had ingrained in his mind what that jail looked like. And so, this is where people were getting shot. This is where people were getting hanged. This, and this. They weren't rooms. They were jail cells. And they looked like this. And this is where the guy was sitting for this. And this. And so, like, he had his whole epiphany up there. And it was beautiful. It was overlooking the whole place. It was a gorgeous view. It's a beautiful hotel. Nobody would have known that. Like, people that were there wouldn't have never known that was jail. And my father had this whole cathartic moment of like, and of course I was the only, nobody went up there with him, and I was like, that's weird. Nobody's coming up. And I'm like, I didn't know any better. So I go up there with him, and I'm thinking I'm going to have a great, little moment with my dad. And it was a great moment. Not the way that I expected it, of course. But when that happened, I think internally for me was a little thing that said, don't ask too many questions. Just don't ask too many questions because we don't know what they're tainted with, And so my father, towards the end of his life, he would show me things, and he wasn't a teacher. He will say, come with me, and I'll go outside, he says, are you watching? Yes. And I had to watch like what he was doing, putting things together. If he was making a balm or he was making an oil, he's like, did you see? I was like, yeah, he was good. That was it. That was his teaching. There wasn't write this down. He never told me look at the moon, look at nothing. It was all very natural for him, And he's like, if you're watching, you're learning. Because when I first got to Miami, I had to learn how to drive. I left here, I was 17. I never, you go to New York, your subways, you never learn how to drive. Come back, I'm 37. I'm like, oh my God, there's a car. I have to learn how to drive. And I said, Papi, can you show me? He goes, you see me driving, right? I said, yeah. He goes, so I'm like, no, it's not to say. He goes, no, if you're watching me, you're learning. And so you should know how to drive. So that was the way he taught. He wasn't a teacher. He wasn't trying to, and I think my mom is a little bit like that as well, which is why maybe I take the role on as an educator where I'm like, let me show you. And I'm not a hand holder, by the way, but I will show you what I can in the process because it's important because I never had that, right? But with my dad, I think in that moment, I realized I can't ask too many questions. And my father was full of stories and he was happy to share. But if you asked the wrong thing, I think it would have caused chaos. So he never, and like I said, the few things that he taught me, I do this agua florida that he taught me. He was like, this is what you do. You see this, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. You do it at this time. You see that up there? Yeah. The sun. Yeah. Okay. You see how it is? Yeah. That's how you do it. That was it. But I wasn't like, hey, Papi, can you show me? No, there was none of that. And I think with some of the women that I've spoken to, that both Mexican and Latin America in general, like Osamaya, I talk about, she's like, nobody taught me. It was just grandma did. I saw grandma. I copied grandma. That's it. That's what you do. So from the Cuban lineage, I know that I wish I knew more. It has its own set of rules, right? Like, whether you were doing Yoruba or Santeria, they are a little bit more, I want to say, superstitious in certain ways that I'm not. Like my dad would say, never put scissors on the bed, never wash certain dishes in hot water. Like there were things like that in the house you couldn't do, and so, but other than that, I wish I knew more, but I don't. I can't really speak to anything except certain things that he taught me very specific. And even then he was like, don't tell anybody. I'm like, okay, I won't tell anybody. It was always like, watch me and don't tell anybody. I'm all right. But he realized, I think towards the end, that I was doing something different. And then he was, because at first he had a very difficult time. He's like, what are you doing? Like, you're not a curandera. Who are you kidding? Like, what is this? Where did you learn this? I'm like, I learned it from you. And he was like, oh yeah. And then he would think about it. And then, but towards the end, the last 3 years, where he realized, like, oh wow, she's actually doing something. She's not just, she's not in a little laboratory and putting, water and oil together. No, like she's actually doing something. And the first time that I realized that he actually valued what I was doing was, he asked his friend. No, he took me to his friend who was studying Yoruba and doing stuff, here in Miami. And he goes, I want you to bring this specific thing that you made. I was like, all right. And so, my dad brought me up as a girl, but almost also as a son, because he would include me in things that I think only you would include sons in. Maybe I'm wrong. You're a man, you would tell me. But like when he would hang out with his buddies, he would like, come hang out with us too. Have a beer, have a tobacco. I'm like, oh. So I was hanging out with the boys. Like, so like, I don't know, my dad was very open that way. And so he goes, come with me and my friend. And so I go and I see his friend, and his friend is doing some reading with the shells and stuff. And I don't know what that means. I'll be honest. I have no idea. I just know that they throw them up like tarot and then they read them. I'm like, oh, cool. But I don't know exact details on that. And then my dad's like, okay, now that we're done and the client had left and all that, he's like, show him, I want you to try my daughter's medicine. Show him what you made. And I was like, what medicine? Because in my mind, again, language, I don't like the word medicine, because it's not medicine, it's gifts and offerings, right? It's natural. And so I'm like, what medicine? He goes, what you made? I'm like, oh, that. And I was like, wow, he called it medicina. I'm like, oh my God, that's so like weird and strange. And okay, so he believes in what I'm doing. Okay, cool. That's awesome. And so there was a moment where because I lived with them, they saw me day to day, and he saw the way that I was living. He was like, okay, this is real, and so it was different. It was different after that. And then he was more up to show me, but I never questioned. I never asked. If anything, I feel now that he's passed, it's safer to ask his spirit, like, hey, can you show me certain things? Hey, can you guide me in certain directions? And I'll be really honest with you, I've yet to hear his voice, but I feel like it's a little safer now. And yeah, he had a lot of poverty in his life and a lot of heartbreak in different ways. And I don't think that again, there's a devaluing of the natural ways when you're poor, because that's poor people stuff. Like, you don't want to do that. In the book I say there's team chamomile and then team tilo, right? Tilo, oh, what's tilo again in English? I forget the word, but tilo is also the same similar relaxing herb as chamomile. And so the poor people have chamomile, right? Because you can grow it in the backyard. And the Spanish people, the people with money, have tilo because it grows on a tree and it's got a cycle of harvesting. Sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't, and when it's not there, it's more expensive, right? And so it's unfortunate, but there is a little bit of that in Latin America. And so for him, asking him questions and, just if I listen to the stories and I play the stories in my head again, there's a lot there for me to uncover, right? But I never asked him directly, and I never asked him to be taught, and I also, I'm very clear with what my gift is, and I'm very clear with what I want to offer the world. So I never asked, hey, can you teach me how to do X, Y, Z? When he showed me how to do that, I didn't ask him for that. I didn't ask him for that. He said, I'm going to show you something. I said, okay. And then when I went to Guatemala last year, I brought a little bottle as a gift to one of the maestras, and she opened it up and she smelled it and she goes, who taught you how to make this? And I said, my father. And she smelled it again. She goes, this was given to you for your protection. I said, I know that's what he taught me. He didn't teach me so I can sell it. I did it because people were asking me. They were like, hey, what is this? This is amazing. Can I get a bottle? Sure. I don't mind making it. But originally and I know that's why he taught it to me. And so that's also the interesting thing. Like, even if I had asked, what would have he really taught me? Only what he wanted me to know, right? Like, that would have been the little caveat in that, right? And so I wish I could talk more about Cuban. I don't want to talk into, I don't know anything about Yoruba. I don't know anything about Santeria. I don't want to say things that are going to be misconstrued because I don't know. I do have a friend who is an incredible priestess in that tradition from what's it called? Trinidad and Tobago, and her father is a priest, and she's amazing. She's Tobago.
Interestingly, tobacco actually is what it is.
So she's amazing, and we're really good friends. But she also is, she mixes different things, And when we met, she's one of my incredible. We're friends now, but we started off as she was a client, and she was the first person where I was very clear, like, do you trust me? Do you trust me? Because if you don't, whatever I give you is not going to work. And it was the first time for myself as a healer that I saw everything, the energetic, the physical. I saw it all. And she was, she came to me with something, and I said, "Do you trust me?" And there was no question mark. She goes, "Yes." There was just, I said, "Throw all that away. You only need this. Take that." Well, and sure enough, and I think that's why we became friends, because she's like, "You saved my life. I would still be taking all this if you hadn't just given me that." And it was just one thing. For me, it was very clear in the moment at the time. Maybe when she started that regimen that she was on, it was a slightly different timing, energetic, all that. But so she's an incredible healer. She's an incredible priestess. You should have her on your show. And she can talk more about that than I could, because that's the tradition, Unfortunately, I don't have anything that I could say, not even within the house, in terms of, that essence. He wasn't, by the time he was doing healing work with other people, because my father did do some healing work with people, it wasn't about the philosophy and religion that he was in. It was more it was an embodied knowledge. And that was very different. And that's what I saw. And that's, I guess, maybe the example that I mimic. It's what's embodied. I don't ever give anybody anything that I haven't tried myself, or that I haven't done myself. It doesn't, it's not, like when I make supplements, people call them supplements, or when I make, tinctures and all that, I will have that tincture for a month. I will try it. I want to make sure it works. I'm not just doing stuff. Again, to me, an herbalist, that's frivolous and just on the surface. Oh, have this to this. Have you tried it? No. I'm like, why not? Like, then you don't know. You don't really know the power of the herb that you're giving me. You don't know the power of the formula you're giving me if you haven't tried it yourself. So for me, it's very important, and that's one of the things that I did learn from my father, which I think is also a little bit maybe of an ancestral thing going back to shamanism, where people have to embody it, right? They have to have it in their body to understand it. And so I think that that's interesting. But I other than that, I don't really have specifics that I could talk to. But yeah, unfortunately.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know it's especially things around Cuba, it can be a very sensitive
It is.
topic, and it's like I said, when I was there, there's a deep happiness of a people who really have nothing, and as you said, at the same time, a very, very deep sadness. And I think anyone who goes there and doesn't feel that sadness, it would be quite strange to not feel that. I mean, I think you'd have to really be living in an alternate reality, which they do kind of try and
Yeah.
put you in as a tourist. But yeah, I also interestingly just got back from Russia, and you feel a
Yeah.
lot of that, a similar heaviness there as well. I think, a lot has changed, but one of the interesting things that you mentioned, kind of talking about the histories of these countries. And one of the things that I found really fascinating, and I really commended you for in the beginning of your book, which is that you write, and I think a lot of people maybe on the surface haven't thought about this or haven't looked into it deeper. But this idea that, often what we call these very traditional practices, a kind of twofold point. One of the things you just said, which I think is also very important, is that these things aren't static or stagnant. I mean, they're not like stuck, and they don't evolve. I mean, they're living traditions, so they're constantly evolving and changing. But also one of the things that you mentioned is that a lot of what we often consider like traditional Latin curanderismo or curanderismo is actually a mix of a lot of different traditions, not only like different indigenous traditions, but very heavily influenced by European traditions as well. And I think that's often something that's not kind of spoke about a lot. Obviously, I think people are familiar maybe with the more surface level of ideas of like Christianity that have become very influenced in a lot of Latin American traditions. But even a lot of the practices are very influenced by what could be perceived as European ideas. And you speak about some of these in the book as well. These ideas of humors, of these ideas of hot and cold, which you also find in traditions all over the world, from traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda. Um, even the idea of things like perfumes and, things, alcohol derived things. I mean, these are all like inputs from outside. Can you speak more about that? Because again, I think for a lot of people that may come as a shock, that these things aren't inherently like in a vacuum, devoid of any outside influence. And that's one of the fascinating things about Latin America is it really, I mean, the Americas in general, including the US, we often in the US, we use this term melting pot, but I mean, all over the Americas. I mean, it's a fascinating like amalgamation of countries and cultures, because it really is unique in history, in that you have all of these different influences coming in and really melding and molding and creating something very unique. And while certainly these traditional practices are very traditional, and I think probably much older than even we tend to give them credit for, I think far older than we give them credit for, they are a mix. And I think it's something that's also important to speak about that. And I think sometimes people are afraid of speaking about that because they think it somehow takes away or degrades the tradition. And I don't think so at all. I mean, I think any tradition is always wise. I mean, the story of the traditional shaman or healer or curandera was always, as you said, very few people called themselves those titles. And very often if someone is referring to someone who's doing that work, probably the most common title would be something like a sabio or an
Mm-hmm.
elder, someone who has knowledge, someone who has wisdom, which, in this day and age is perhaps getting less common. But part of that idea of wisdom was you had to go out, you had to go to other cultures, you had to go
Yes.
to other
Mm-hmm.
villages, you had to go to other healers, you had to go to other wisdom keepers to learn from them, to one, acknowledge that, hey, there is other medicine out
Mm-hmm.
there is other knowledge out there, and then to sit at the feet and to receive that knowledge, and then to allow that to ferment and cultivate inside you so that you could then go back to your people and to share and spread that.
No, absolutely. And I think part of it is that, the example I gave at the beginning, a grandmother learning to be a midwife and doula to save her daughters and her grandchildren, like if somebody ever was born, feet first, what do you do? You had to learn from somebody, like, what do you do? And so, and back then, we used to have, a lot of people think when you think of like the older times, like the towns were separate because we're all about separation of, but it used to be more like, oh, there was one person that would go to different towns and bring back different things, right? Dereke is exchange, right? Because we didn't have money back then. So what do? You go and you take your tomatoes, you go over there, you bring chickens back and you exchange for tomatoes or corn or whatever. And that also is the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of information. And so and so's daughter passed away because of baby. And I'm like, oh, wait, but somebody else's daughter would live. Let's go ask them. What did they do? So I think there was a lot of that happening in the tradition, which is why we have different. So, for example, different towns have certain types of curanderos that are very specialized in, for example, susto. Susto is shock. And when we talk about shock, we're talking about somebody who was maybe in a car accident, right? And we say that the energy, I say energy, I don't say spirit, but so everybody is on the path with me. So the energy of the person will jump out of their body and it will stay out there. It will never come back, right? And so that's susto. That happened to me in December. I had a car accident. It's going to be almost a year. I know I'm still not back in my body. I know, I feel it. There's certain things I do where I'm like, oh, that's because I'm disembodied. Okay, I got it. I understand that. Right. But I also live a very secluded life. So I don't have a lot of disturbances. Because what happens when you have susto and you don't know you have susto, you start going a little crazy. You're doing things that you don't really normally do, and people tell you, hey, are you okay? And you're aside from the grief that goes with it, right? Um, there are things that happen to a person, and so somebody can say, wow, you're suffering from susto. I can see it in you, right? Because some people can see that. And so there's places, I forget the name of the place, but there's a place in particular where where you go when you have susto and you can get rid of it, and they specialize in a very specific form of limpia. A limpia is an energetic cleanse. What do? They rub a black chicken all over you. That's the limpia. They don't kill the chicken, but these chickens look rough. I will tell you that much. They don't look good. These poor animals. But that's what that place specializes for, right? And so if somebody wanted to learn this tradition, that's where they would go and they would watch and they would talk and they would, you know. And again, every person that teaches differently. So what's expected of you to learn in exchange, I don't know, right? But you can go there. You can go to this place and you can get now. In order to get there, you have to go walking, right? Like this is a tradition. The tradition is the person that's looking for the healing has to go walking. They have to do sort of like a devotional sacrifice as to get there, which means you have to go walking. Sometimes you have to go barefoot. You have to go, through a certain pathway. So there's all these things around that, right? And so that to me is more what I would consider traditional. And if other people wanted to learn, they will go there, right? So that's one. That's one part of the answer for you for that. The other part is we are very much about self-preservation. And a lot of the things that we do in curanderismo that I believe, for example, like cupping, I don't know if there really was a cupping tradition in Mesoamerica. I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows. Can you look at a hieroglyph somewhere or at a mural somewhere and say, well, that looks like a cup and it looks like, yeah, you can do that. But like the reality, we don't know. Right. And so how does cupping come in? Cupping comes in because some trader brought it back from China. They were passing through Latin America. They were like, hey, this is a way to remove internal, what we used to call humors, right? And the way I explain to people humor, so I don't get into the full details of them because people don't really understand that is there are certain energies in the body that get stuck, right? And you want to release them and they don't come out in any other way. What do? You push the body, right? Like when hueseros see a physical pain that's an energetic pain, they will massage it out of the person, right? With special oils and a special technique with the hands, all that stuff. But if you can't do that and you're not a huesero and you don't know about the body and you're not sure, you can learn how to do cups, right? And cupping is a form of bringing in something for survival of somebody else, right? Because you're, as a curandero, your job, if you're really taking it, your role in your job, if you're taking it seriously and you want to help people, it wouldn't be good for you to be stagnant and only do one thing. You kind of have to learn all kinds of different things because you never know who's going to walk in through your door, especially if you're 40 miles away from a medical center or away from, like, you have to. That's, I do also call curanderismo a living tradition. It's constantly changing. Again, we're meeting the needs of the community. What else is the community? One of the things that I think for me that was very shocking was when I started to ask questions about curanderismo, mostly in America. When I go to Mexico, people don't really question where it comes from. They just say that's the way things are. There's acceptance there. But in America, it was more like, well, it's not really all about Mexican healing work. We don't have real records. We all of our papers, all of our books, if we wrote any, because, I'm recently studying with this woman who was very beautiful. She's like, our books is something that we were so proud of our knowledge, we put it in our bodies. So we embroidered, we weaved it, and all of that was burnt. And so if that really was our books and there's nothing, like, how do we really know? How many great grandmothers we have alive? Very little, right? Unless you go to little towns and there is lineage there that you can follow and say, oh yeah, this person and this person, they taught this work, this one person that's living this. So we know, right? So we don't have that. We don't have that the way we have with Jewish mysticism and science. We don't have that with Muslim, we don't have that. We just don't have that. And so a lot of the stuff that we talk about, we sort of have to acknowledge that we understand it and we believe it with a pinch of salt. But a lot of it, I do know when I started asking questions here in America, it was like, well, this really comes, and they were very clear. This, like, for example, the cupping comes from either traditional Chinese medicine brought through by a Spaniard, or it was brought through from an African trader. We're not sure, but it's there. Okay, great. But it was people who really want to give legitimacy to the work, right? And sometimes that's impossible. Somebody like Ernesto, there's what legitimacy can you ask him for? None. He's got a don, he's got a gift, and you got to trust that, right? And that's the part where I think things can get very muddled for people. You're not going to a doctor who has a certificate and they went to Yale and they went to, you don't have that. That's not what we're looking for. So it's interesting to see and to hear and to experience that, because for me, I was very shocked that some of the stuff, like the eggplants. Now, I don't know maybe it's because of the content that I look at, but like my Instagram, it's flooded with, this comes from Africa, this comes from Africa, this is the Mexican. And it's like, but it is Mexican because we do it. My mother, if she's going to be 82, her mother's mother did it on her. So yeah, you can tell me maybe the origins are African, but at some point somebody got off a boat and showed it to some Mexican, and the Mexican was like, hey, this works, let's do it, And so there has to be acknowledgement that yes, it is maybe something that comes from a different tradition, but we incorporate it because it works. Perfect example, and this one blew my mind. Empacho. Empacho means, and I write about it in the book, it's indigestion, basic indigestion. However, it could be indigestion because you ate something bad, because your energy is low or high, right? Because it could be both, or because you have unexpressed emotions, right? Those are the three other reasons. There could be more, but these are basic three reasons of empacho, indigestion, right? And there's different ways of doing it. My mother always has empacho because she eats a lot. She doesn't have a gallbladder also, which is very interesting, right? But so she goes to this Cuban friend of ours who does this thing with this. I don't know if you've ever seen it. They do a scarf. They do a ritual with a scarf, and it's like this. Wow. Again, I don't know if it's because my content and what I look for, or maybe what I was looking for, hashtags on Instagram. I get this thing called las medidoras, which translates to the women who measure. And it's about 4 women in south of Spain who are continuing with these traditions that are pretty much the basis of curanderismo. I was like, wow, I have to go meet these women. one of the things that they don't show you the whole. I mean, I wish they had the guy had the director who's the son of one of the women who is a director and wanted to sort of encompass and encapsulate all these teachings that his mother had and the stuff that she's doing. He made a documentary. And so it's about four women, and they show you four different rituals, and they show you what they do and how they do them, and they talk about it. It's all related to Catholicism. They pray Padre Nuestro, which is our Father, right? They do all that stuff, and then and that's where that thing comes from. I was like, that's the origin. You can go to Mexico, and they would tell you that they invented it, right? They could, and they probably will. But then now we have a real documentation that, hey, this was alive for great, like I think 3 great grandparents before. They've been doing the measuring of the scar for impact, right? And they have a certain way. They know when it's cured, right? And they know when it's not. And so now we're starting to see that, and now I can see it across the world because of a little device, right? So it's interesting because, again, we don't have anything written down, and a lot of people in Mexico, the reality is that people in Mexico that live in the city, specifically Mexico City, when you say, oh, I'm going to a curandero, it's a very novelty thing. It's not something that a lot of people believe in a lot. It's not something that people go to regularly. When they're sick, they go to the doctor like everybody else, right? But the few people, when you step outside of the big cities, and this is like general big cities, so when you step out of the big cities and you go to the pueblos, or even like middle-sized pueblos, it doesn't have to be a smaller one, you will find somebody who calls themselves a curandero. And if you ask them, where did you learn? What did you do? Some people would say, I was born with this. And so you're going to trust, right? There's nothing written down. There's no certificate. There's no training for that. And there's some people who would say, oh, my great-great-great-grandparents used to do this and they taught me. But nobody ever says, well, the egg comes from here and this comes from here. And, and that's a very, I know that people are thinking, well, that's appropriation if you don't give people that, but it's not, because it's something that we've been doing for centuries. And I know at the beginning, when I think about it, and I'm thinking about being colonized, right? If we put ourselves in the position of being a colonized culture, you're going to say yes to a lot of things to survive, period. Like you're not, especially if you're watching what's happening around you, and so I think a lot of one of the bigger reasons, and this is, I have a hard time with that whole, I was raised a Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Catholic. And so I have a hard time when I walk into a curandero and they have a giant picture of Jesus. I have a hard time. So, and that's me. That's not on them. That's me. That's my own personal thing, right? But I have a hard time with that acceptance, with that blatant acceptance, because I feel like there's something that we're missing when we negate the indigenous side, right? And that to me feels more like appropriation, if you even want to call it that. But I also know that that person can be an excellent, amazing healer because of their faith in Jesus Christ, right? And it's like a two-way prong, right? But I know that a lot of this information that we've been using for centuries, in lieu of medical information and advice, because we didn't have anything else, it's because of survival, because we wanted to survive. That they maybe added some extra stuff that they knew from their Mesoamerican great-grandparents. And we're talking like centuries, at this point, we're so removed from that. But do I think that some of that was probably leaked in? Absolutely. Because not every curandero will heal in the same way, right? So there has to be a personal energetic that comes in, right? And that's very, very, very unique per person. But also, I think that's part of the reason why we can't really just say, well, this comes from here and this comes from that. And we've all used it at some point or another. All of our family members have used it at some point or another. If they're in that lineage or if they've been part of that sort of healing modality. You can't separate where everything comes from. I think that's coming more into question now because of that idea of appropriation. I think a lot of it is also coming into a lot of question because there's so much being extracted from the Amazon, and it's being used without any real love, that I think people are just questioning, and I understand that, but I also think that people need to also step back and say, oh wow, this person also has thousands, or this culture has thousands of years of using the same thing, maybe at this point now it's theirs too, I always think about this because and this is maybe like a really weird sort of way of translating this, but Dolly Parton wrote "I Will Always Love You," but Whitney Houston sang it. And when Dolly Parton was documented, or they asked her like, "What do you think?" She's like, "That's not my song. I wrote it, but that's her song. She made it what it is, not me. I just wrote it." And being able to have that reflection of like, "Oh wow, yes, maybe this came from Africa, but at this point, the way that we've been using it for centuries, we kind of perfected it. Maybe it's ours now, and it's okay to say that." So I feel, and giving everybody their due diligence, like, okay, yeah, no, it was probably used for you guys in this way, but for us, like, and I'm talking specifically the cleanse with the huevo, with the egg, it's core. Like when people reach out to me on Instagram, that's what they want. Can you give me the egg cleanse? And it's like, no, I don't do that. But I mean, I do it now, but that's something that I learned in my 40s. My mother was like, "You're not strong enough to know that." Like, she gave me a boundary on that very, because she's like, I can do this for you, but you need more time to learn how to do that. And meantime, I have a friend who's like, "I've been doing that to myself since I'm 4. I'm like, "Well, good for you, girlfriend. That's not me." But so again, I think a lot of it is, I think for me in general, with all of these healing things and all of the healing modalities and anything that has to do with healing and sanadores and curanderos and shamans, you have to have a very large perspective. And not only do you have to have a large perspective, you also have to have a very large acceptance of what can and cannot happen. And I think people want it to be like medical doctors, white and red equals pink. No, not always. Right? And red could also be black. Like, you have to be open to that. And I think that's something that we don't, there's a lot of absoluteness that has come from the medical world. Like, it's absolute. This is, what? That's not the way it works in healing modality. It just doesn't, And so I think when we approach these modalities in any culture, we always have to come with an expansive frame of thought for the interaction, because we really don't know what we're going to get, no matter what they tell you. Sometimes even I'll say yes to sometimes the healing work where I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen, but we're going to try. Now, my expectation and my experience says that if I do this, this should happen, but it might not in your case. And if you're open to that and you're okay with that, let's move forward. And some people are yes, and some people are no, and that's okay. But having that expansiveness, I think, is very important. But yeah, I hope I answered your question. That was like a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that was a beautiful response. Going back to one of these ideas, you mentioned this idea of susto, and just using that as an example. One of the, as you said, all of these systems have their benefit, and obviously there can be certain things that maybe a more Western medical system may be superior at. But certainly there are limitations for everything too. And I think one of the things is like that idea of susto. Like, if you were to go to a Western doctor with those symptoms, they would probably have a difficult time finding a remedy for that. Maybe they would give you anti-anxiety medicine or some form of sedative, but in general, that probably wouldn't bring the person much relief. Maybe in the short term, but certainly not in the long term. So that idea of susto is also kind of a shift of cosmovision too. Like, it's a shift of a worldview that the ailment that's going on could be something that could be seen as energetic or spiritual, not something that's solely physical. And that tends to be a very common theme in a lot of Latin American traditions, that there are these different layers or levels that can be worked on. There's the physical level, there's the mental emotional level, and there's also this more ethereal or energetic body. Can you speak a bit more about that? I think that's something that more people are becoming maybe familiar with or open to. But in most of our Western system, we don't really speak in those terms, or if we do, we also separate them in the sense that you would go to, an allopathic doctor, and he or she would prescribe you some pharmaceutical or some remedy that's essentially working on the physical body, the chemical structure of the body. There's too much or too little of something. Something more mental emotional, you would have to go to a different specialist. That would be someone like a psychologist or
Right.
psychiatrist. but those things would be completely separate fields, like not seen as necessarily interrelated. And then something on a more energetic or ethereal, that's not even something we would really consider in that field at all. But again, in a lot of these traditions, they're seeing an interplay, a dance between these, and that sometimes, like you said, something in that specific case of susto, like that energetic, that ethereal body, is actually the root cause. And if that's not healed, then the physical ailments aren't going to go away.
Correct. Yeah. So that's sort of like why I think curanderismo can be a real gift. And I want to get into it, but I need to make a phone call real quick. All right. Sorry about that. All right. Beautiful. So yes.
It's nice hearing Spanish again. I'm in Portugal now, and it's such a change having to listen and try and speak Portuguese.
How's
So
your Spanish?
I miss Spanish.
What rate do you give yourself?
Well, now it's probably decreased because I've been away for a while, but I don't know. It's hard for me to judge. Maybe a six. I mean, I'm pretty conversational. I can understand pretty much everything and speak and get by, but having super deep conversations is still a bit more tricky in Spanish than English.
Yeah, that's okay. But you have to be in it, like you said. You have to be in it. Otherwise, you do forget. It's normal. All right, beautiful. Yeah, no, she just wanted to make sure. I told her to text me before she comes in, because then the guys are going to go crazy. So I don't want that to happen. And I'll let you know. Okay. So answering your question. So yes, most people, when they have pains, aches, emotional, we call it imbalance nowadays, right? When we have that, there are all kinds of specialists for that, and they're all separate and they don't talk to each other. That I think is the part where, for me, when I think about, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with an X-ray. I don't think there's anything wrong with an MRI. I don't think there's anything wrong with looking up blood and figuring stuff out. I think there's nothing wrong with it. I just think people need to talk to each other. I think that if there was, so I have been a real pusher backer on the AI thing, but if there was an AI specifically for doctors to talk to each other, that would be genius. Because then people will start to see, like, oh, wait, I can't do that because this person, like, I just think we need to have a visual of a person, like a full-on visual of a person. And I think that's where curanderismo kind of shines. Personally, that's why I believe that I really love the tradition. When people come to me, and I can only give you the example of myself, when people come to me, right, the core of curanderismo is the plática, the talk. You sit down and you're really talking. You're not just like, what's your name, your intake form. No, we're having a deep conversation. And it's a conversation, and this is where I think the don happens, where you have to be open, an open channel to sort of ask questions that made no sense at that moment. I have a client who came in, and she's a writer, and she says to me, she goes, she said to me, I don't think I need the session with you because you've already kind of not explained, but cleared things for me in a way that nobody else has. But I'm still going to have the session with you because I want to meet you. And I said, great, love it, let's do it. But if you're open, and this is for me, like when I talk to people who call themselves curanderos, if they don't have a plática with me, and this is for your audience too, if they're not sitting down and having a plática with me, that's at least 30 minutes. And they're not just asking me like, what does it hurt? How does this feel? But they're asking me about my life. What do you do? Who are you? Like sometimes they will ask you, whose son and daughter are you? Right? Like, where do you come from? What is your life like? What do you eat? What do you do for exercise? If you do exercise, do you have children? When they ask you these questions, and again, it's a hefty conversation. I've learned now with the people that I work with, I have to do the practica separate because it's usually about an hour and a half. We'll talk, we'll do the Zoom thing, and then they come in, and then it's just a session, right? Like the physical session. But curanderismo has that beautiful part where if you sit down and you just talk to somebody, sometimes some of us just want to have a cup of coffee with a friend. And I'm not saying you got to vomit all your shit out because I don't do that either. I don't even do that with my clients. Like there's a moment where I'm like, okay, let's rewind and let me ask the question in a different way, because this isn't about letting all your beast out. No, it's just about like really specific questions. When you're with a really good friend that's known you for a really long time and you're having a hard time and you sit down with coffee, they just know the right questions to ask, right? It's the same thing. And it's not psychotherapy, right? To me, I love psychotherapy for certain things, but I also know that there's a script to that. And that's different. that means that the person isn't really listening to you, they're listening for you. And that's a different story, right? When you're really listening to a person and they're there and they're present and they're just like, when they feel that love and care, because that's really why you're doing it, that shifts the energetics of the person that's in front of you, not only for themselves, but in the interaction with you. And so that I think is what's really important and really beautiful about curanderismo. Because then if you have a person that can attune into something like this, for example, with susto, right? There's different types of sustos. There's the one where accidents happen in their physical body and the energetic body are sort of maybe separate and they need to be enmeshed again, right? Or there's a separation there that needs to be nurtured, right? And then there's susto with, for example, grief, like somebody calls you and says so-and-so passed away and you literally just spoke to them and a day before and you're like, you know, and you don't, that emotional content that you don't know how to manage, right? Like, so there's different types of sustos, but when there is a person that you trust that can see maybe a little bit more than you can, because you know, a lot of people, and this is something that I think Julia taught us very early on. She's like, if you guys are going to be healers, what you're healing will come to you. In other words, like when I'm healing my father's death, a lot of people that came to me were dealing with their father's death, right? And there was a moment in time where I was healing. I lost my train of thought there. I wanted to talk to you about something specific, and I completely forgot. You're talking about susto.
I think that idea of this kind of more integrative approach of doctors being able to talk to each other.
Yeah, no, but there was an example I wanted to give you, though. It's really good. Oh, completely forgot. Completely just.
Mm.
It went out of the ether. It went out of the ether so quick.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I'll continue with the idea of curanderismo and having the plática as the core, and having that person that you trust that you talk to. If the curandero or curandera is present, right, and we're working with the don, right? Again, we're talking with a person that's a little bit more connected to that spiritual realm, to the energetic realm, right? They're able to see things that you don't, right? I remember now what I was going to say. And so sometimes people come to these people, and they already know that they're off somehow. You're like, I'm not myself. There's something weird. I can't really put my finger on it. And then the person has to ask the right questions, right? The curandera asks the right questions. Sometimes it happens that you had a fall or something fell on you, right? That's also like a shock to the system, right? And so what happens is you start having somebody who can see sort of like the energetics of a person and say, and ask, hey, did you have a fall? Did something hit you in the head? Usually it has a lot to do with head trauma more so than body trauma. And the person's like, oh my God, yes, I fell. Something happened and, I either fell on my kid's toy or the dog was around and I tripped and it's like, oh, well, that's what it was. Right. And so you have people that come to you sometimes that have that innate knowledge of, oh, there's something wrong with me and I'm not really sure what it is. And then there's people who come to you and are like, I feel off and I have no clue what could have happened. Right. And then there's people who come to you like, no, I had something really horrible happen to me and I don't feel like myself. Right. And so the role of the curandera and curandero is to sort of like manage that for them. And not just say, hey, this is the remedy for that, because there are very different remedies for different types of shock. I want to say that there's levels of shock, right, and different things. For example, birth, right? It's a shock to a baby's body to be born. You're going from an encapsulated space that's warm and everything's done for you, where you literally are just passive. You're not really doing, you're just sucking it in, right? And then you come out and you're like, you have to physically use this body that you were born into for the first time. So a lot of babies get baños when they're born, right? Even though they tell you here, don't bathe the baby. We're like, no, we bathe the baby. Now you don't splash them with water, but you give them a baño with ritual herbs, right? Or oil to make sure that their body, when they start moving it, is energetically enmeshed, right, with their energy. So there's different types of shocks. And so I think one of the things that curanderismo is really beautiful in is that we have all these limpias. I have a hard time with the word limpia because not everything is about cleansing stuff out. I think sometimes it's just about aligning things, right? And sometimes we need to like align the energy of this to this and make sure that it stays together. And so sometimes what happens is we have to find the right limpia for the right type of shock. The chapter before the last in my book is the one where I it's my favorite chapter of the book, and it's where I give people very specific things to work with. Very specific things to work with. Sorry guys, I got a puppy here. And it's raining and thundering in Florida. And so it's a very specific Rama. Quiet. So you have a very specific herb that can go with a very specific limpia for very specific reason, right? And so that chapter in the book for me is probably one of my favorite chapters because I'm trying to give people the education to do it for themselves. And it's very heady because there's two charts that sort of correlate with each other and they have to dance with each other. But you can do this at home, right? If you're listening to yourself. But that I think is one of the biggest things that curanderismo does for some people is a mirror. The curandero can be a mirror to this person and figure out where the shock comes from, what we could do to help the shock, what type of shock is it? Is it something kind of superficial, or is it something a little deeper, or is it a shock that triggered another shock that wasn't healed, right? Because that could be a thing. Or sometimes, specifically when it comes to shock, we can come to the curandero and have absolutely no idea, and then they have to guide you completely and totally. So for both of those, it requires a lot of trust, but it also requires a curandero and curandera that's fully present and that is not a superficial healer, especially with shock. Shock is the root of a lot of illnesses, both physically and mental, emotional. And in curanderismo, that's where, and I said this before, I did a quick yoga training, or I was part of a yoga training for a friend where they were going more into deeper energetics of yoga. And she's like, I want them to learn how to clear their energy. And nobody's ever taught me like you have. So I want you to teach them. I was like, sure, let me come into that. And so what I said to them was very clear, like your mental, emotional view of yourself and the world is directly connected to your energy. And so that means that if you're seeing everything like, I have bad luck, everything is bad for me, nothing works out for me, that's an energetic thing that you need to work with. It's not just, oh, my body hurts and my energy's off. No, it's like that your mental, emotional, and curanderismo tells a lot about a person. And so when somebody's depressed, that's an energetic imbalance. When somebody thinks like everything is bad luck, that's an energetic imbalance, right? And so when it comes to susto, curanderismo works really well because of that, because we're looking at the mental, emotional results of the trauma that happened energetically. And so I feel like that could be one of the most hardest things to work with, shock specifically. But it's also one of the jewels of curanderismo. Like my mother had shock and they did 3 different treatments when she was young. Only one of them worked, right? I know I had shock when I was young for something that happened to me when I ate something really bad and I had to live in an oxygen bubble. When I came home, my dad did certain things. They worked. I know they work because I remember going, oh, I'm back. And I remember opening my eyes and go, oh, I'm home. And I don't remember what happened the 2 weeks before that. Right. So I know that worked. So, when from Julia Grace taught us, when you have the right remedy for the ailment, it'll work immediately. And I think in curanderismo, you see a lot of that because people, again, the plática, people are really listening. They're really there and they're genuinely wanting to help you. That works, and for shock in specific, the curandero is taking the role of everybody. He's taking the role of the medical doctor, of the psychiatrist, that role that person has is everybody put together in one. And so you don't have to talk to anybody else. You can literally just sit there and listen and act as the role of everything and really help this person, if they can be helped, because sometimes it could be something else, but if they can be helped, you do. And so I think that's really wonderful about curanderismo. One of the things that I love about this particular practice, and again, I don't know any other practice, and maybe there are other practices out there that do the same and work the same, but I know for me, the plática, sometimes, like I said, people have the plática and they're like, oh wow, I just wow, I just feel so much better, and I'll have this session anyway, but I feel like this hour and a half was just exactly what I needed, and it is almost like a psychiatry, but it isn't, because I'm not a psychiatrist and I'm not giving them certain things to do and I'm not listening for cues. It's just, I'm just being a human being and I'm just open and I'm listening. And I think a lot of really good, genuine curanderos are that, they can do the healing work they can do because they genuinely want to help somebody and they're genuinely listening to this person. And that makes a big difference. And specifically to shock, that's the beginning of the journey to heal shock, especially when people don't know that that's what they're in the middle of, because sometimes you don't know. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I felt very distracted.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a super important point, and that human element is often, I think, very much overlooked. And even kind of as you mentioned, this idea of AI, I doubt that it will ever be able to fully mimic that human connection,
Never.
and because
I don't
it's
think it'll ever. It is, that's
yeah.
uniquely ours. Even with the animal kingdom, it's uniquely ours. That's something that, yeah, you can't replicate. I mean, you can replicate it when you give birth, but you can't replicate it.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, I think that's something we lose touch with, and is that essence of who we are. Kind of moving to your book. I mean, I have a copy of it here. Thank you to your publisher for publicist for sending it. It's a beautiful book. It's also, I think, really nice because it's not super long, which I think is beautiful. Like it's very readable. It's a beautiful, I think, overview for people who are interested in this work. Can you maybe speak a little bit about it? About like what kind of drove you to write it, and also if people are interested in it, what they can find in it, and just to speak a little bit about it, because it's a beautiful, I think, book that you were able to encapsulate a lot of ideas into.
Oh, thank you. I was really, yeah, like we had chatted before. I was really nervous about, specifically with you, because you have all this knowledge about Latin American and like traditions that even me as a Latin American know very little about, because that's unfortunately very real in our life for Latin America. Yeah, the book came into being sort of like on its own. I wrote the story about the birth of the book. My father, every year that I lived at home, and even when I didn't live at home, he would call me on my birthday at 12 p.m. or 12 a.m. every single time. Sorry. So yeah, my father would tell me the story of my birth. And it always started even before I was born, but then he would get into the details of how I was born. So, one of the things that I've learned is how you were born is sort of like how you show up in the world. And again, it's even before the actual birth itself. Like, did your parents plan for you? Did your parents not plan for you? Like, what were the circumstances of your mother's, pregnancy? Like, all of that is part of your birth story. And so I read the birth story of the book, and I never really had. There's people who want to be authors. They're like, I want to write a book, and this is the thing. Okay, beautiful. I was not that. I started this little folder on my laptop that said book because I wanted to write a manual. And then now, in hindsight, I realized I wanted to write a manual so I could teach a course, so I could teach people how to do their own apothecary remedies. Like, I think that's sovereignty. I think that's important. I think you should know that. Everybody should have that basic knowledge that should be taught in schools. How do you take herbs and make stuff so you can use for your body? Because you need it sometimes. And so, for I think it was maybe 5 or 6 years, I did a course called Folk Mexican Herbalism, and I would teach on Zoom and online. And I wanted to make a manual out of that, and so I wrote it, but I wrote on the book, and I was like, all right. And eventually so we're 2025. I always have to go backwards. 25, 24, in 2023, at the end of 2023. No, at the end of 2022. At the end of 2022, the publisher reached out and said, we would like for you to write a book about Latin American herbalism and maybe curanderismo if you're interested. And I said, sure, tell me more. And this was November of 2022. They're like, we'll need it by March of 2023. I said, that's impossible. I'm not an author. I don't write for a living. I don't have enough. And they do that because sometimes people have enough information and they just have to sort of organizing and put it in black and white, you know? I didn't have any of that. I was like, definitely not something I can manage. But I'm interested if you can give me a year, maybe. And then I didn't hear from them until the end of 2023. And they were like, all right, we're giving you a year. I'm like, all right, I could do this. And so that's how the books like sort of first started. And I really, they were very clear. It has to be a beginner's book. Don't get too heady. Don't get too crazy, but you can write anything you want. And they were very true to their word. I wrote things in there that I was just like, let me see if they don't knock any of this out. And sure enough, the process of writing a book is very simple. You write your outline, you write your pieces, you write your information, and then you just write. And so for me, I did the research of like what other books are out there already of Latin herbalism, because I didn't want to necessarily, I wasn't opposed to repeating. I think repetition actually is good. If you really are a student and you're looking at this and you're like, man, every book has chamomile, that tells you something. There's a reason why chamomile is in every book. It works, right? And so like I wasn't opposed to repeating, but I wanted to also make sure that I was giving people something that maybe was a little bit new to them as well, And for me, that became stories. Some of the stories that I write in there, are very uniquely me and are very specific to the book, and they're new to people. A lot of the herbs are probably repeated from other books too, because again, we all have the same stuff. We might maybe using it a little bit different, but we definitely have a lot of the same herbs. And so for me, it was a sort of like a putting together a lot of and a sharing of my stories with my own personal journey. I didn't have a book to go back to. When I started this, I mean, if I really want to look back, it was probably late 20s, so about 20 years ago. And this idea of herbalism still hadn't hit. I think we are past the cusp now. It's starting to like now, for example, in North Carolina, everybody's an herbalist, right? In Portland, everybody's an herbalist, right? So like, I think we've gotten to that point where we hit the spectrum top of like herbalism. And so, but this took 20 years, and a lot of people, they take it for granted, especially the 20-year-olds. They walk into a space where it's already there and they're like, oh, everybody does it. No, we didn't do this 20 years ago. This is like still kind of new, And so, and in some countries, it doesn't, it has never left. For example, if you talk about people in Costa Rica, they trust herbs more than they trust the medical doctors, right? And so for some people, it has never left. I can't speak to Europe and the eastern side of the world, but at least for us here in the Americas, there's some places where it has never left. But for us in America, it's something that feels kind of new, but it's not, And so the book for me really was a way to just share my story in a very simple way. I didn't want to use big words. I went back and forth in against language, because this was really for somebody who knew nothing, because there's a lot of people out there. And what's been really beautiful about the book is the feedback that I've gotten from specifically first generation born here from Latin America whose family have lost complete knowledge of this. And they're like, wow, I didn't realize this is part of our legacy too. Or, hey, I sat down and whose grandparents sometimes are alive, like, I showed my grandmother and she's like, yeah, we used to do that. And we also used to do this and this and this herb. I'm like, write it down, make your own little book, So that's what's been really beautiful about the book that I've loved, which I didn't expect. Because I definitely did think of it, and I took that very to heart, that it had to be a beginner's book. One of the things that I think I did a little bit different in the book than other people is I gave everybody just all the apothecary formulations at once. Like, this is all the things you can do. You can pick and choose herbs, but this is all the things you can do. I think it's like 27 different formulas that you can do. You just have to pick the herbs, right? So I think that part was a little bit different. The book is divided into, I didn't want to go into the body system, but I thought it was important. I do talk about herbs and qualities, which comes from a very traditional Western herbalism. And I talk about the book, why that is. We are influenced by them. Chamomile is not native to Mexico. It's native to Europe, but they brought it here. And unfortunately, what we used to use is gone. Now, if you go to Oaxaca, you go to Puebla, you go to different places of Mexico, you go to different places of Guatemala, you will find different chamomile-like herbs, which is what they continue to use, which maybe were more traditional. Now, are they really Mesoamerican? I don't know. There's nothing written down, so we don't really know. But does that change from pueblo to pueblo? Absolutely, as it should, because every pueblo has different climate, right? There's different earth, there's different types of harvesting. So, but you at least have, if you think of like the herb chamomile and it's relaxing, and it's the first degree relaxing and the qualities are cold and then you can actually talk to somebody else about that and say, hey, do you have an herb that's relaxing, that's cooling, oh yeah, we have this. Maybe it's not chamomile, but at least you have the quality. So I wanted to give people that as well. Because even though it's beginner, it does give you a little bit of knowledge and education in that part where, herbs actually have qualities to them, And so I really wanted to make sure that I touched on those little things that, if you look at it in the general scope, are really helpful. And the book itself is divided into 4 major chapters, which are the sun, the moon, the breath, and the heart. And that really goes back to all the different body systems that we have. A lot of people think of the body as a whole, but they're actually 8 different systems working together, which is really beautiful. So the sun is about digestion, the moon is about our nervous system, the heart is about the cardiovascular system, even though I get more in the energetics of it because I'm not a cardiologist. And for me, if your energy of the heart is positive, usually the organ is good, and then the last one, which is the breath, which is the respiratory system. And so, the book was really well thought out. I really, before I wrote it, like the organization was really important for me. And it's also sort of like the way that I learned. I learned about qualities, then I learned about formulas, and then I learned about the herbs. And so it's kind of like a reflection of that as well. And I'm really happy to hear that it's easy to read and simple. I didn't want it to get heady. This wasn't a medical journal. Like, there's other people who do that really well. Go read those books. That's amazing. Go for that. That was never my intention. And I also do love the storytelling. So, the stories in there are really, really nice, and there's stuff that I really wanted to share with people. So I'm glad to hear that it was something that you enjoyed, and hopefully others will enjoy it as well.
Well, beautiful, Josie. Thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you'd like to talk about as we begin to wrap this up?
Well, I really personally would love to hear what your opinion is in terms of, because you can hear mine in the book about curanderismo and shamanism. Like, do you feel like there's bridging of them themselves, and I don't know if it's something you want to put in the interview or not, but I would love to hear a little bit more about that since I have you here. Because you have so much more knowledge of that, and a lot of us Latin Americans, we just, some of us know curanderismo, but we don't even have a clue. Now we are starting to hear about that whole idea of dietas and all that. Like, I didn't know. I asked Jan, I was like, Jan, what's a dieta? What's that for? Tell me more. Again, that 8-hour drive was awesome. And he gave me so much information, and I was like, wow. And I said to him when we got to where, I was like, thank you for sharing that with me. I would have never known. Nobody ever teaches us this kind of stuff. And, at least in Mexico, very little is known. Very little is talked about. And there isn't this idea that I want to learn more. They're sort of like happy where they are, which is kind of like a detriment, I think. But I personally would love to hear that if you want to share that. But that's my own thing. Aside from that, I'm good.
The difference between
Curanderismo and shamanism.
Shamanism and curanderismo. I think a lot is, maybe as we were talking about, is quite semantic also. I mean, like you said, I think very few people who do these practices would call themselves any of those things. I mean, it's usually something someone from the outside kind of labels you as, because you're just you, we're us, we do what we do. And it's an interesting thing in that it is a little strange for a lot of people outside that worldview. So you try and find some label to kind of put it into, but often those labels are quite limiting. But I mean, I think kind of, as you said, from a lot of these traditional viewpoints, there's these three levels of healing. There's physical healing, mental, emotional healing, and spiritual or energetic healing. And so, and I think usually any of those practitioners, whether it's a shaman or the curandero, is working on those three levels, whether they maybe actively realize it or not. Maybe what would separate, I mean, because, for example, in the Amazon, people will use those words interchangeably too, like a shaman or a curandero. I mean, a curandero is a very widely used term for someone who does that kind of work. But again, it's, for example, like one group of people who I spent a long time with, the Shipibo Kanibo people, who become very well known for their work with ayahuasca. Ayahuasca, even it's a Quechua word, which is kind of like Spanish in a way. It's kind of a catch-all language that many people speak, although you do have Quechua people, but because it's kind of this communal language, that's often the words that get thrown around. And so ayahuasca is a Quechua word, but for, any group of people working in a tradition has their own words for these plants. And so ayahuasca, for the Shipibo Kanibo people, they call it uni, and someone who works with uni is an unaya, which usually means like a wisdom keeper. So it's someone who has knowledge. And so ayahuasca, uni, is a gateway to knowledge. And it's seen that knowledge comes from spirit. In these cosmovisions, it's the physical plant obviously is embodied in this earth, but the energy of it, the spirit, actually, they would say comes from the stars. And so these plants like ayahuasca or tobacco or wachuma, peyote, all of these maybe what would be considered master plants or teacher plants, or plants of knowledge, plants of power, plants that kind of allow us to go through these different dimensionalities, and obviously to heal our physical body, although, in many cases that's even a secondary or tertiary aspect. And kind of like, as you were saying, I think because of a lack of our own cosmovision of how we look at things, often these plants, as you said, get categorized as like medicine, because that we don't really have anything else to describe them as. So we just lump them in this term of medicine, which is true to some degree, but that also implies more of a physical healing or maybe a psychological healing, which is also very true. But those are two levels of something that's deeper. And the primary aspect that ultimately what a lot of these maybe power plants or teacher plants are pointing to is more of the spiritual aspect. And that's where that idea of knowledge comes from. And so usually I think when people are speaking of like a shaman, it's someone who's knowingly working in that dimension, who has the cosmovision, who sees things that they are able to traverse those different dimensionalities of time and space. And again, this idea that what we see, what we hear, what we feel is all real, and it's not everything, that there are things beyond the eyes, there are things beyond the ears, and that those can be accessed through certain techniques, through certain practices. And much like you said, there's many ways to learn these techniques, and some is through a teacher, some is through a dawn, through some near-death experience, someone is struck by lightning, or it's passed down from generation to generation, or someone is just born being able to connect or to hear, or to connect in some other way. And there's so many ways. I mean, even like outside of the Amazon, in the Andes, I mean, you have people who speak to mountains, and they say that their wisdom comes to them from the mountains, and the mountains heal them, the mountains teach them. And so they commune with the energies of the mountains. And, but I would say that that's probably like, in a very broad sense, maybe one of the differences, if there is a difference, because again, those two things can very much so be used interchangeably, but usually that idea of shamanism entails some traversing beyond what we would call ordinary reality. And there's certain plants or techniques, and specifically, like you were talking about with Jan, maybe what he was talking about, some of these plants, like ayahuasca, or we actually were very fortunate and to work with Iboga also together. But these are real, like ancient tools, and that's why they were so sacred. And that's also that idea of that sacredness of them is connected to spirit, because they were actually seen as gifts from spirit portals, doorways into the realm of spirit. Because it was always seen that's not necessarily the easiest thing to access, and that's why there's ritual, there's a sacredness, there's rites, there's passages, there's initiations, there's traditions, like you said, this idea of dieta. It's a very specific practice to learn how to communicate with the spirit of these plants, to receive the healing, to receive the teaching, to receive that knowledge, so that we can truly begin to embody it. And it was often seen that much like I think a lot of traditional Mexican practices, this idea of like offerings, or in Peru, these ideas of like despacho, like offerings, there has to be this reciprocity. Like if we're going to receive something, then we have to be willing to give something. And to receive something very, very high, very beautiful, very profound, we have to be willing to sacrifice in that same way. So depriving ourselves of food, depriving ourselves of outside contact, depriving ourselves of friends, of family, really going into a period where we strip ourselves bare to where, essentially that's where these ideas of like death and rebirth come, which, very much like in Mexico, like the temazcal, like people often think of it as a physical healing, but that's maybe more of a superficial way of looking at it. Like usually if you ask someone who has a deeper knowledge of temazcal, it's amazing for the physical body, but that's also kind of a byproduct. Like it's a deeply spiritual practice, and ultimately it's a practice of dying and being reborn. And, going into the mother's womb and really experiencing that. And so I think it's the same with these practices. Like there's often a deep ritualistic practice which involves like a deep sacrifice, so that in essence one can begin to die. A lot of layers can begin to shed away, and much like you emerge as a baby, then you become very open, very accessible to this much more subtle knowledge, which is even why we use these terms. Like the physical is more the base layer, it's the foundation, it's something very rooted, it's something very strong, which is beautiful. The mental emotional is more like we're moving up to something finer, more subtle. And the spiritual body is the most subtle. Like it's very fine. It's even hard to necessarily put our fingers on it, or to put our eyes on it, to put our ears on it. And so it's something very fine, like, only in this state of being very open, very sensitive, like a baby, are we able to really perceive these very fine teachings. And so that's kind of that idea of a traditional practice like a dieta, which is usually some sort of initiatory experience to really deeply receive the wisdom of those plants. And very much like you said, that idea of like a don, like a spirit, a master, a guide of the essence of this plant, that becomes your teacher, your ally, so that you can really embody the teaching of that plant, like the energy of something like chamomile. Like you can be chamomile, you can embody chamomile without even necessarily the physical medicine of it. And you can give that through the energetics, through your word, through your presence. And eventually in these kind of maybe more shamanic spaces, usually that's what is being done, is all of these like dons, all of these allies that you've formed this connection with, that have taught you, you're beginning to call upon those to come and do the work, whether that's physical healing, whether it's working with susto, whether it's as you said, like calling people's souls back, or weaving their DNA, their epigenetics back into harmony. Like however we want to look at that, that's that space where that's able to happen.
Beautiful. I love that. I think that's one of the things where curanderismo today is lacking just a little. You know, the temascaleros, which are, again, they're called temascaleros. Nobody ever calls them curanderos in Mexico. You know, at least with the traditions that I've been, you know, a temascalero is like a really powerful, very independent person, male or female. You know, Rosa Maya is the one that I ask about temazcal because she's been doing it since she's very young in Guatemala. And that was my experience with her. You know, I did a temazcal with her. And that's where we have the ceremony, where we have all these beautiful rites, you know, before you go in, right? While you're in there and when you come out. And yes, it's absolutely seen as the womb, you know, a space of wombness where you can come in and you can transform, you know, not just you can transform. And I think it's beautiful. And it's one of those places where I feel like that to me is more in alignment with the Mesoamerican beliefs, I think, personally. Whereas curanderismo in general, I still feel like, and I love the tradition, obviously, you know, I'm part of that, but it's a tradition that still feels a little sort of displaced, you know, just a little bit. And so that's why I was asking you, like, what do you think is the difference? And I do feel like the responsibility that comes with being, in my mind, with the shamanic forms and the curanderismo is a little bit, there's more responsibility there, you know? Whereas in curanderismo, there's, you know, the curanderas that do the energetic work, because we have, and it's usually mostly women, but women and men who do the energetic work, and usually only energetic work. You know, they do the altar work. You know, we have the altars, and there's candles being placed for different things, for different reasons, for different people, and they're constantly being tended to. You know, it's like that fire that never goes out. And so there's more of that there, more of that energetics, more of what I feel like is also closer to what I would consider more shamanistic viewpoints. But they're few and far between. You know, they're few and far between, at least in Mexico. I think in Peru, I think in the Amazon for sure, you know, or at least in Brazil, there's still more of that essence still alive, you know. But it's beautiful to hear, and that's why I wanted to ask you that, because I was really curious. You know, again, it's very different. You know, Mexico wants to be modern. You know, it wants to be. It claims to want to be more than what it is. No, that came out wrong. It's more like they definitely want to modernize what they feel, you know, is old. You know, it's kind of like, I think it's, even though it's been around for thousands of years in this form, I think it still feels like a teenager, you know? And so, you know, unless you go to the pueblos, you will find, you know, abuelitos y abuelitas, you know, grandmas and grandpas who are doing the healing work. But like you said, they're not talking about it. They're not advertising. They're not, you know, it's not about that. And they're definitely doing the three levels, you know, the physical, the energetics, you know, and again, the emotional, you know, for us, that's the key for us. It's like, you know, we watch what people say, how people say it, you know, and it's that whole idea of mental health, like what's happening behind, you know, that tells you a lot about a person. But, you know, and you have the autonomous, you know, to me, they're not just indigenous, they're autonomous. They are, they're not considered, you know, in Mexico, they're very clear. The indigenous who are autonomous, like people who work with the peyote, they are their own people. You know, they are part of Mexico, but they're their own people. Like there's a form of respect there, right? Like those are, to me, more shamanistic for sure approach to the rites, the ceremonies, a little bit different than what I discuss in the book and the way that I was taught and raised, and probably people of my age, probably a little younger, you know, that have the idea of curanderismo as a certain way, you know. So that's why I wanted to ask you, because it is a little bit more nuanced. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
And also kind of coming full circle to, you know, it was interesting. I think before we started recording, you said something very beautiful. I think it's going to sit with me for a while, but You actually didn't manage to do it, which you said you warned me that being a woman, you might like start crocheting or doing something in this idea of movement. And, it's something that I think we've gotten away from is these ideas of roles. And I think in a lot of our society, we've forgotten that. And in traditional societies, the role is very
Hmm.
important. It's seen as a fundamental part of who we are. And, even in some of these societies, like the Kogi and the Tubu, who I've spent some time with, they would say like a lot of our suffering comes because we've forgotten our roles, which is like essentially we've forgotten who we are. And you said something really interesting, which I hadn't thought about, but makes complete sense to me, which is this idea of like the woman not sitting still, like being the energetic feminine. It's the idea of movement, of flowing, of dancing, and the man with that idea of stillness. And you're saying like on a podcast, like you might be doing things, and
Nobody likes it.
maybe
They
for
want me to
men it's
just be
easier to
right here. I'm
just
like,
sit
I can't.
still.
That's impossible. Yeah.
But I think it also like goes to your point, which is that, a lot of these stronger practices were more male dominant, but they also weren't necessarily meant to be something that's like
Hmm.
woven into our day-to-day lives, like with frequency. I mean, something that's really sacred, something that you're doing with a lot of reverence, like it's not something you do every
Exactly.
day. So
Exactly.
a lot of these things, and I think that's why a lot of women, like when I was in Mexico, the teachers I had were all women, and like they were helping people day in and day out. Like there was no break that. But it was these practices of massage, of temazcal, of herbs, and treating people with their day-to-day
Yeah.
lives, and this natural dance and flow of life, that things are always in an ebb and flow and coming and going, and really having to be there and to work with people. And it's much more sustainable, and it's much more real in that sense. A lot of these sacred paths, like, if you look at Iboga, for example, in Western Africa, I mean, traditionally it may only be done once in your life. Like, that's it, one time. And so there's a tremendous amount of preparation and, a community coming together to support someone. But in general, these sacred rituals weren't meant to necessarily be done all the time. And so, there's something about that as well that I think is important, that it's not necessarily something that's meant to be like woven into everyday lives. Even the Temascal, which is something that can be done more, like it's hard. Like if someone has done a Temascal before, like usually you're not necessarily looking forward to doing the Temascal. Like you're probably happy to do it there, but you really have to summon some courage, and especially if it's done strongly, like four doors, and it's really hot in there, and it's dark, and you're in a traditional clay one. I mean, there's no escape. You can start to get
There isn't.
claustrophobic. It's packed in there.
Yeah.
I mean, you're literally, they talk about dying and being reborn. I mean, you feel like you're dying. You
Yeah.
see also these shamanic ideas of really having to look at your mind, to having question your thoughts, who you are, and you think you can't do it anymore. You can't take it. You're looking around. You're wondering how everyone else is doing it. You literally feel like you're dying. Your mind is going crazy. And often, like, the only way is some form of surrender, but also some form of spirituality. And that's why I think, for example, like the song is so important. Like, you have to start singing, you have to start releasing, you have to start moving that energy, you have to start praying, you have to start offering yourself up to something higher. And that can give you the strength to carry through. But, it's a very intense practice. And the Temascal, like you can't do that every day. Your body can't do that every day. Your mind can't do that every day. Your spirit can't do that every day. Like it's a sacred ritual, and so often, those people who do those practices, as you said, they are very strong. They are warriors in a way, but they also served a very particular role in that society, which ultimately was no better or worse than anyone else's role, than the herbalist or the farmer or the beer maker, the bread maker. Like all of these were very sacred roles. Like each of them served a function. obviously that connection to the spiritual realm was something very important, and something that in traditional societies very much helped to guide the society. So, there was something sacred, something of a reverence of that person. And also, like you said, traditionally that person tended to live kind of away from people on the outskirts of the village, because they were often seen as someone um, a bit non-conforming, someone who kind of shakes your worldview too. And often that person lived a bit more in isolation, a bit more away from people, because also they had a deeper connection to that realm of spirit, or to the land, to the plants, to the animals.
Sometimes they were just very sensitive too. That allows you to be
Very
sensitive.
sensitive.
When I
Absolutely.
sat at the beginning of this
Absolutely.
podcast series with the book, people were asked, "So what do you do?" I'm like, "I'm a hermit. I don't go out." Woo! Look at that. Truth. I
Yeah.
have my little thing here. Let me go put that up. But I'm a hermit. I don't go out. I try not to do anything. And people don't understand that. They're like, "Well, how do you know?" I'm like, "I don't know how I know. I don't have a clue." And they, "Oh, apparently she wanted to meet you." We have
Yes.
Navratri happening. And so I started with yoga. And so part of my practices with yoga was getting into the divine feminine. And so now you can see my Kali figure. Today is the first day of Navratri. She apparently wanted to meet you. Hello. This is Jason.
Hi.
So hold on, let me put this back up and I'll start. I'll get back on that.
It's beautiful to get a little glimpse into your altar and
I
your
know.
life.
I tried not to use it with the podcast because people have all kinds of different reactions, especially the people who want to be traditional. Hold on. Let me see. Who want to be more traditional in the curanderismo. They, in Latin America, yoga is unfortunately seen as very negative. And we're talking like, when you bring out the picture of Shiva or Krishna, they're like, "Oh, is that Jesus? How can that not be?" We're talking like very, Mexico. Again, it's in that teenage years where the culture is accepting, but also doesn't want to rebel. So it's really interesting for me. But yeah, so I what I started doing was covering it up so people wouldn't have questions, because I didn't want to rock the boat. Even though I talk about it in the book, I started with yoga, and I still believe all that, and I talk about doing meditation and mantra, but people have a reaction to that, very strong reaction. So anyway, but yeah, going back to what we were talking about, thank God you can edit, right? Um, it was it is really interesting to see in curanderismo how it is part of a life. It's just part of life. It's part of village life, if you want to call it that. And I think it's also the reason why it's still considered a living tradition. Whereas, especially with the temasqueros and the mascaleros, people think it's like a sauna. You just walk in, you do sauna, you rub some herbs like in, the Russian style, and then you go home, and it's like, no, this is like 3-4 hours. Like, you're in there for a while. Like, what's happening in there is a transformation. And so, yeah, it's really interesting. But people don't think about that. There's an influencer, an Instagram influencer, a woman from Miami who moved to Oaxaca, and she's talking about how she's doing temazcal every week and she feels great. And I'm going, that's not temazcal. You're going into the sauna. That's great. It's good for your body. I love it. That's not temazcal. And having that idea that you only need it when you need it. That this isn't, and I think one of the things that's happened with herbalism in general, at least in America, is, and some places in Mexico, again, because the idea is, I'm in pain, I need something for the pain. I am depressed, I need something for depression. So it's only in the moment. Or if I don't want to be, then let's use it as an alternative, right? So let me have turmeric every single day to reduce anti-inflammatory, no matter what. And so I think there is that idea also that people feel, especially, and I'm thinking about the people who do ayahuasca every month. I'm like, do you understand the times to go to master plans is when your heart and your mind are in trouble? Like when there is no other way out, that's when you go to these master plans. You don't go every month for upkeep, and like, your life must be really hard if you're going because it is like you said, like, you only go to these master plans, you only go to these rituals and rites once in your life, because you shouldn't be like there shouldn't be, your life shouldn't be to the point where you need to do this every month. There is a time and a place for it. And so I think a lot of people don't understand that about certain master plans. But also one of the reasons people do like curanderismo, because you can do it. It could be part of your life every day, you know? And so that's why I was asking also, like, how do you see it? Like, what's the difference? And is there a difference? And it is. I do think curanderismo is a little bit more approachable. And, going back to what we were talking about right before is, these people, when you're working with the energetics, with the spiritual world, with the unseen world, and you become more sensitive, and you do become a hermit, because everything that's coming at you is just information. At least that's for me the way that it's happened, in the past 10 years, and I think one of the interesting things that's happened for me especially is because I've done meditation for nearly almost 25 years now, and I don't miss my meditation practice. I do, transcendental meditation, like that's important for me. And when I first started that first day, I was like, wow, this is different. This is new. For me, that's really the beginning of my journey. Like being able to see something else that I was raised in. I was raised again like a Catholic. You go to church, but there was never an internal looking in. Nobody ever sat down and looked internally. Close your eyes, breathe, like listen to your inner thought. Nobody ever said that, and so I think that that's what's become for me the core of my personal practice, to be able to. So it's like my personal practice is meditation, and the results of that have been, stepping into my lineage, which is really interesting because a lot of people don't understand that, and there are people who say, well, how can you do this work when you don't believe in anything? And I'm like, well, I do believe in something. I may not believe in Christianity or the Christian idols or all that. And I also don't think I need to believe in the Mesoamerican idols either, right? Because that's not what I was raised into. So it's interesting in terms of the connection to the spiritual unseen world, like, having that have developed, at least for me, in a different way than, other people, I would say. Or even I've never used master plants. I've never done ayahuasca. I've never done peyote. I've never done any of that. And Jan would always say, wow, that's so interesting that you've never done. I'm like, I've never done any of that. I've never, I fell once when I fell and hit my head when I was little. So maybe that's my portal. I don't know. But, I never had that need, which is, as I think you maybe have experienced, people who do these medicines, sometimes the people who do them with somebody who's an incredible facilitator once in their life, it opens up their life in ways that they never expected. And sometimes they also become facilitators. And it's, I've seen some people who do that, and it's beautiful. It's like you said, it's a portal to that space. But then they also become very sensitive, and little tiny little things sort of like throw you off. And it's not in a bad way. It's just, at least for me, I acknowledge like, oh, I'm not going to come back to this particular grocery store at this hour because there's way too many people, right? Like little things like that. And so it's interesting to see that. And circling back to the conversation, like being a hermit, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes the internal thoughts that come through are more important, and maybe that's where the dawn develops, and that's where the listening develops, and that's where, at least for me, that's sort of been my experience. So yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I asked you that question, because I wanted to know like the difference of the nurturing of curanderismo and shamanism, because for me, I still feel like there as much as they could be a little bit interwoven, they definitely stand alone. And I explain that to people because some people say, "Oh, you're a shaman." I'm like, "No, I'm not a shaman." There's certain things I don't do. But yeah. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I would say I long to be a hermit. I miss my hermit days now. Now I feel like I'm being called to too many other things, and I sometimes I long for the day when I can return to being more of a hermit. But thank you so much, Josie. This was a beautiful conversation, and I think you did a beautiful thing with the book. And as you were saying, especially if people take it and learn to do this work more themselves, as you were saying, like this used to be so commonplace of, especially women and grandmothers and, who really embodied these, just as you were saying, people who just knew plants from where they're from. And that reminder of people that we all do have this knowledge and we can relearn it and rediscover it and to become, we don't have to become a healer of other people, but to become a healer of ourselves, of our families. And it's so important, and it's so empowering. As you said, it also changes our worldview. It changes our mind. It changes how we look at the world. And I think it makes us far far deeper and just stronger people, not just of the body, but of the mind and spirit. So I think it's beautiful what you're doing. Say hi to Florida
I
for me.
will.
I miss that state. I used to fly through Miami all the time,
Right?
going back and forth between South America and just stepping off the plane into that humidity. And I loved it. So I love the rain. I love everything about it. So, and one day I'd love to come and visit and say hi,
Oh, you're always welcome.
and maybe
Always.
we can get a coffee, a nice Cuban coffee, and catch up with Jan. He's a dear friend.
Yeah, I would
So
love that.
I hope to do that. And thank you so much for sharing. If people are interested in buying the book or contacting you, learning more about you, what's the best way they
They
can
can
do
go to
that?
curanderaremedies.com or Latine with an E, herbalism.com. That gives you all the portals to my space.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for sharing and for doing what
Thank
you're
you, Jason.
doing. And I hope we're in touch. I'm sure we will be at some point in the
Would love
future.
that. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, everyone. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It's really a pleasure for me to sit down and talk with her, share with her. Really beautiful energy, and I hope you all got a lot out of that interview. As I mentioned in the intro, if you're interested in working with myself, my colleague Marav Artsy, we are actually sold out for our last retreat of the year, which is November in Peru. But hopefully by the time this interview is released, hopefully by the end of October, we will have our 2026 schedule finalized, or at least or beginning to open some of the retreats. You can check out my website at nicotianarustica.org. Also, Instagram is a great way to stay up to date. It's my name, so at Jason Grachanik. I'll put a link to both of those in the show notes. And then, as always, if you're able to support the podcast, that's a really big help. Patreon, I think, is probably the best way. It's a website. You can sign up for as little as $1 a month. There's different tiers you can sign up for. I really like the idea of that website because it's based off this idea of reciprocity. So if you feel like you're gaining something from this podcast, it's an amazing way to give back. Thank you as always to all the patrons. It's really your support that allows me to keep making these episodes. I'll put a link to that in the show notes, and as always, helping with the algorithm. So if you're viewing this in YouTube, Rumble, hitting the subscribe button, turning on the notification bell, liking the video, and if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast or Spotify, just leaving a starred rating and a short review is a really big help. So thank you all for tuning in. I hope this finds you all well, and I will see you all on the next episode.